You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the Fan2Fan road trip. That's right. We took a road trip, and we took the John Carpenter Driving Tour. We're talking all about it. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, co-host extraordinaire Pete Charbonneau. And Pete and I had the fun experience of a road trip across the majority of the U.S. We did not go west, young man. Pete decided to go east, and I decided to tag along. We got to see a lot of cool sights. We've talked about Tombstone. We were able to check out Roswell, Nashville, and when we were kind of planning this out, I think it was more kismet than anything else, Pete, that we kind of stumbled onto a stop along the way as we were making our way to the Carolinas that kind of coincided with our love for a specific film director, Pete.
Yeah, someone that anyone that's listened to Fan2Fan before probably has heard the name mentioned because we are contractually obliged to mention him every episode that we do, regardless of the topic.
That's right.
And so that person is, of course, John Carpenter. And I got to give you the credit for this, Bernie, because you kind of identified Bowling Green, Kentucky, birthplace of John Carpenter, and a place that I don't know, was it his birthplace or that just, I know he taught there.
He was born, Carpenter himself was born in New York, 1948, and his dad ends up accepting a job at Western Kentucky University as a music professor, and they relocate. And I think he was like 3 or 4, so he was pretty young when they go from New York to Bowling Green, Kentucky. And we got to go, which was kind of neat because the Bureau of Tourism set up a 17-spot self-guided driving tour. To be fair, I think this is where literally your mileage may vary, because when we got there, we were very excited because the one thing, and no surprise here, none of his movies were actually shot in Bowling Green. So if you had the opportunity to do this tour, you may be a little disappointed because you may think you'll see Smith's Grove or you'll see the lighthouse from The Fog. You don't see that because all of that's in California. So we're not actually going to the spots, but rather places that are referenced in the movies.
Halloween. Newsweek magazine calls it a superb exercise in the art of suspense, the most frightening flick in years. Halloween. The Chicago Sun-Times says it's so scary, I would compare it to Psycho. It's the kind of picture, says the Chicago Tribune, that forces you to sleep with the lights on. A masterpiece, says New York's New Times. Halloween. From Compass International, rated R.
When he made Halloween in 1978, he included several references from the Bowling Green area.
I remember over in Russellville, old Charlie Bowl was about 50.
These sites have since become a hot tourist attraction in the region.
We're constantly looking for ways to increase the tourism appeal of Bowling Green. This was another opportunity to kind of bring in the younger generation, to let them see the connection that Bowling Green has with Halloween and John Carpenter.
And if you're listening to this, you're thinking, well, what did you guys see? So a good example. So obviously Halloween, where Michael Myers was kept in Smith's Grove, Illinois. Well, there is an actual spot named Smith's Grove in Kentucky that we got to see the sign for. If you're driving around Bowling Green, you'll see signs for Russellville, Regent Avenue, Clay Street, Richardsville Pike. We saw some of those. And that's kind of it. You're just driving around in the place where John Carpenter had his formative years, and kind of got his influences, and then decided to throw in the names of these streets that were a big part of his life into his films. So they obviously meant something to him, just like Bowling Green meant something to him.
Yeah, they always say, write what you know, and this obviously was his opportunity to kind of take places and names that he grew up with that were ingrained in his head. And I know all of us have those places. If you were to talk about your childhood experiences, you've got, for me and for frequent guest John, one of the places that we had was Pat's place, which was this haircutting studio that none of us ever went to, but we would meet in the parking lot behind Pat's place, and we would sit, all our high school friends, in the parking lot for roughly an hour or two trying to figure out what to do with our lives that summer night. And it would just be a lot of should we do this? Should we do that? And 99% of the time, we just ended up at the diner with our friend Chris ordering Belgian waffles and making a mess of the place. But that, if I were to write a film, a screenplay, Pat's place would probably make itself in there somehow. So that we got to experience those things that John Carpenter grew up with and inserted into, a bunch of his films. And again, like you said, Bernie, your mileage is going to vary if you do come through Bowling Green, which is a very small town. You're not going to see like iconic sites. You're going to see, street signs that reference, Russellville. There's Russellville, old Russellville Road or something like that. So you can geek out a little bit, and we did. I mean, I won't lie. Seeing the Smiths Grove road sign was pretty damn cool. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of awesome.
It's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
It's especially sentimental to Bowling Green, Kentucky, because Halloween director John Carpenter used to live here.
I grew up on the western campus, literally. Behind the Kentucky building, before they built the girls' dorms over there, it's a little log house. That's where I live.
We also tried to track down an old 1800s cabin that he lived in when he was a professor on campus.
Well, when his dad was a professor, I think the only rationale that we came up with, and see if you still agree with this, Pete, is that this must have been housing for professors, for faculty. They literally had a few log cabins, and, his dad's the new music teacher on campus. And they're like, well, here's where you can set up shop for you and your family. And, if you're moving across from New York to Bowling Green for a teaching opportunity, like, you don't say no. And you end up, if you're John Carpenter, growing up in a literal log cabin.
Yeah, I would guess maybe they had the opportunity of like, well, you can have modern housing with all of these amenities, or you can stay in this old log cabin that that was, I don't know if it was gifted to the university or it just happened to be on the site of the university. But that's kind of a unique experience that, if you've got a young family, maybe you do that for a year or a semester or however long, just because how often are you going to get that opportunity, or your kids are going to have that opportunity to kind of experience life living in a log cabin? I think it's not a functional home anymore at this point.
The one thing beyond the street signs that we saw, which was kind of neat because it gives you a sense for where he grew up, was the downtown area in Bowling Green, and how where I went to school, it had, the square, and it's literally courthouse in the middle, and all around it, are all the barbershops, the coffee shops, the restaurants that have been there forever, that diner that has that really cheap breakfast meal that you want to go to every Sunday, that kind of environment. And then to see that that's where John Carpenter grew up. And then on top of that, he had a theater in the square, the Capitol Theater.
While Carpenter's father, Howard, was head of the music department, John roamed the streets of Bowling Green, including the local theater, which inspired him to be a filmmaker.
My favorite movie of all time I saw at the Capitol. It was Rio Bravo, and that was it.
And I was reading how right before he turned 14, he started making a few short films, Godzilla versus Gorgo, that featured Godzilla and Gorgo via claymation. And all of this because he saw some of these movies growing up at that Capitol Theater. Kind of cool. Now it's like a performing arts center, but it had that feel, that atmosphere of an old school movie palace that would have played really cool sci-fi movies, that would have played the Howard Hawks thing, that would have inspired him later in life.
Is it human or inhuman? Earthly or unearthly? Baffling questions, astounding questions that not even the world's greatest scientific minds can answer.
Gentlemen, do you realize what we've found? A being from another world, as different from us as one pole from the other.
He saw those movies in kind of this idyllic place. You would want to see old movies in a theater like that.
Yeah, and kind of being in that spot, it reminded me a little bit of when I drove through Paris, Texas, with that town square feel to it. And, I think there's a lot of them dotted across the country. But, it's one of those things if you squint, you can kind of picture what that place looked like in the 50s, because it's not all that different than now. Maybe it's had a lot of wear and tear over the years, but there's still something about it. It still maintains something. And I think we caught a bit of that in Roswell as well, that downtown area. You can almost picture in the 50s and 60s, it had a little boom and it had a little bustle, and maybe it's faded a bit now, but there's still a little luster left on there. You and I personally had to keep ourselves entertained on our trip through Bowling Green, where maybe we didn't see the Smiths Grove Sanitarium, or maybe we didn't see the lighthouse from the fog, but we kind of had that running riff of like every business that we passed is like, this is the Subway that John Carpenter ordered a $5 foot long. And it was literally like every business we passed was John Carpenter went to this Pep Boys, and we did this conservatively for a good 30 minutes, and I never got tired of it. So
not at all. We definitely saw the gas station where he got his first cigarette at the age of 3 and started chain smoking since then. Again, the references, going through the tourism bureau spot is like Halloween, The Fog, and Halloween 2. And then there's like the real life sites. So I think overall, it's kind of neat if you're a Carpenter fan to be there. The Smiths Grove sign was certainly the highlight, but I think you should also temper expectations. Really what you're going to see is a town that inspired Carpenter, that certainly has evolved where he came from. And in some ways, for someone like John Carpenter, who we hold in high regard because of the movies he's made and how entertaining they've been, I thought it was in some ways like kind of it humanized him. He was influenced by the things that would have influenced us, like you said, that would certainly bleed into anything you would create. And then to see how he grew up, where he grew up in person.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where who knows if we're ever going to find ourselves in or near Bowling Green, Kentucky ever again. So you kind of have to just, being the fans that we are, regardless of what is there or what's not there, what was just inspired, to kind of say that we did it, I think is just kind of cool in and of itself, because again, like how many chances that do you get to do something like that? And it's, it was like such a little detour out of the way from our trip east, heading out of Nashville. So it was like a no-brainer that we had to do it. And I think we kind of went in, knowing that like this isn't going to be like a mind-blowing experience. Because again, like it's not like going up to like location sites from the films, but if again, like you said, if you temper your expectations and if you are like a huge John Carpenter fan, there's something to it to kind of just be there and see where someone drew their inspiration from, even from something as innocuous as like a throwaway line in Halloween 2. And, that's like the magic of, at the end of the day, like we're all human beings and, and people are creating different things in different ways, but, we're not all that different. It's some of us might be a little bit more motivated to get into making that film that's going to break through the public conscious and build a career out of it, until you get to the point where you're just too cynical to care anymore. And you just want to watch basketball and play video games all day and chain smoke and churn out a couple of new albums. And, there you go. But I have to laugh because again, like we were driving on campus and we're looking for various signs to just take our pictures of. And I think we had like the Halloween 3 soundtrack going. And I think you had made the comment because we were passing by a couple of students and like, did they ever get tired of hearing, the soundtrack that just randomly played? And like, I have to imagine that they don't even know what the fuck's going on. I
think you're right. I think by instinct, I went to like the volume and dropped it just a little bit because I was waiting for one of the kids, and they looked like kids, at least compared, I think, to us now. They've got to be tired of listening to John Carpenter, like as people are just driving by, maybe slightly creepily trying to find a few things. But it was neat to see the first Wendy's where John Carpenter got his first Frosty. So that was awesome.
Yeah. Again, life-changing experience for John Carpenter and us.
So if you're ever in Bowling Green and you're by a Wendy's, just know John Carpenter lived in that same city and may or may not have had a Frosty at that Wendy's. And if that's not worth the trip, I don't know what to tell you.
He definitely bought a pack of Camels at that gas station that we fueled up at before we left town.
I would say, Pete, he bought all the Camels. He bought every single one of them. Yes.